And so it will be sort of irritating to always say that, but it has to be especially said of Arindam, who comes to us from MIT.
I found it very interesting that Mark proposed that the alphabet was in arbitrary order. I mean, here was I sort of killing myself, thinking what would I say as a representative of the letter D. If I was Rob Grillet, I would probably have something theoretical to say about that. Is this working? Okay. In the India prior to the 1990s, qualitative appraisal of the Hindi film industry came in two formats, both of them oddly enough instituted in 1954. There's the National Film Awards, juried by a crew of mostly auteurish filmmakers and intellectuals, and representing a state choreographed liberalism of the Andre Malraux variety. And there were the Filmfare Awards, representing more commercial aspects of the cinematic market. For 30 years, there was a happy complementarity, even complicity between the two, between liberal state and protected market, officialdom and commerce. The national awards tended to reward some particularly grim, badly lit, but soul-searching art house cinema, offering up something like a national conscience in its explorations of class disjunction, gender, caste, and so on and so forth. And at the Filmfare Awards, by contrast, intense melodramatic performances were prized above self-consciousness about formal style. Between these two formats, Indian moviegoers could sense something like the dialectic of modernity in operation, a radical modernity, ironically promulgated by the state, and a conservative modernity representing the interface between a protected market and an equally coddled civil society. We sense this dialectic present in other aspects of the movies as well. For instance, why did just two female singers so dominate the Indian film scene, and that too two sisters, Lata Mangeshkar and Asha Bhosle, or Nee Mangeshkar? The Mangeshkar sisters had the modernity dialectic down to a family business. Lata was classical and Asha was jazz. Lata was authenticity, and on the other hand, whatever exotic influences there came from elsewhere, Afro rock, the Beatles, disco, Anne Murray, Perez Prado, you name it, everything was kicked to Asha as the more versatile voice. The two of them thus played out their own variant of what in third world development economics was called the import substitution industrializing, or ISI model, where every foreign commodity had to be tortuously reverse engineered into a domestic national variant. Think Serge Gainsbourg in France. This dialectic was nationalism as such. Let the Germans have their blood tests, let the French have their Parisian French. The true test of Indian citizenship, we joked, should be premised on your ability to distinguish Lata's voice from Asha's. Anyway, back to the film awards. That dialectic held good until the mid-1990s, until the regulations on television broadcasting were deregulated in India, and a host of private actors, including Rupert Murdoch's Star TV, came onto the scene. Within a few years, Indian television companies had worked out a quite different understanding of the situation. Each time one of these award ceremonies were held, television viewership went up prodigiously. So what if, rather than waiting all year for the one prestigious event, there were to be several of these events around the year? Each one, sorry, I'm trying to, What if, rather than waiting all year for the one prestigious event, there were several of these events around the year, each one sponsored by a different television network? Think, instead of just the Oscars and the Golden Globes, an NBC Film Awards, a CBS Film Award, an ABC version, a Sci-Fi Channel version, and so on and so forth. What they further surmised was that audiences didn't particularly care who the prizes went to. What they were more interested were the performances, the dances and comic skits, etc., by sundry film stars and starlets interspersing the award pronouncements. Simply put, each award show now pays a certain cast of actors to show up at the awards and perform, and whoever shows up gets an award. So rather than having dances or songs as the hors d'oeuvres, interspersing an exercise in discernment, the balance is reversed. Today's award show is in fact a series of paid-up performances, with the awards themselves set up as a pacer to the sequence of events. Even more importantly, media conglomerates figured out that these faux awards represented something like a marketing opportunity. So in effect, these ceremonies became occasions where corporates were giving awards to their own products. The Filmfare and National Film Awards still exist, but who now cared what a select bunch of apparatchiks or critics might think? The rubric of judgment had inexorably moved from criteria emphasizing validity to criteria emphasizing suggestibility or market persuasion. Now you're wondering what I'm talking about here. So without further ado, let me bring you to this system of objects. What if I were to say that this system comprises what we would consider cultural validity in architectural academies today? In future years, if one went into the archives of American institutions, you would see these buildings appended in portfolios as evidence of competence, as attesting to various promotions or appointments to professorship, chairs of departments, and so on. If you do not recognize the buildings, perhaps you should recognize these names, names of people around us, our friends and colleagues. And if you're wondering under what criteria all of these objects have been gathered together on this one page, by the categories of what Borgesian Chinese encyclopedia, what if we learned that this commonality is indeed, literally speaking, a Chinese encyclopedia? Ordos 100. Just a few days ago here at Columbia, I spoke about some of this stuff, where I was suggesting that perhaps the true discursive inheritor of the global development expert of the 1960s and 1970s today would be the Biennale curator. How do we rate Ordos 100, given that it's a ghost town? As bogus real estate speculation, riding on the coattails of international artistic reputations to bring name recognitions to its backers? As the roving curator's opportunity and desperation to secure one more site of curation and therefore bring a kind of facticity to the act of curating as a global activity, irrespective of any other discernible criteria of discernment? As of the architect's continued incomprehension of reality, even at the very cultural moment that they all profess to be embracing reality? Or is this, in fact, the new reality for the self-proclaimed architectural avant-garde, where a mix of curatorial networking and academic buzz promulgates largely paper careers that nonetheless inveigh against paper architecture per se in the name of embracing quote-unquote practice? And so I'm going to retain the quotes around practice, I think, in good deconstructive style. Which brings me to the question of theory. Theory is not just when you quote Badiou or Derrida, but it is also what is embedded in marketing ads, journalistic reports, weather forecasts, stock options, legal settlements, wedding vows, mowing the lawn, you name it. Which is to say, in the context of institutions such as universities, theory does not reside only in those sound perturbations or marks of ink that we call words that come out of that category of epistemic bureaucrats that we call professors. It resides in the acquisitions of land, committee deliberations, investment patterns, recruitment and fundraising patterns, hiring patterns, salary and benefits packages, the making of buildings, apportioning of spaces, and so on and so forth. Theory is always contingent upon a situation. To the extent that we think conferences such as these, talking about theory, or that the people in this conference determine what theory is, we are not only actively obfuscating the various sites and vectors in which theory operates in a university, in fact, we are also obfuscating what universities do, what they're about. Universities are not centers of knowledge production any more than a corporate board meeting or a farmer's field in Bangladesh. What they are, in fact, are gambles for institutional validation. One reason why we identify certain discursive formations as produced within universities as theory is only because of a certain dispensation of governments and the way they disperse funds. A dispensation derived most recently, which is to say most recently as in the last 200 years, from German idealism in the 19th century, but now somewhat in a state of complete devalidation and retreat. This is the post-war distinction made between basic and applied forms of knowledge, which somewhat sounds like the distinction between theory and practice, but is not, in my view, the same thing. Now, there's a lot of people who weighed in on this so-called distinction, Dutta and others, so I won't go into that, but I will insist on this and only this, that there is no truth criterion by which we can make an epistemological distinction between basic and applied knowledge. The only viable distinction we can make between basic and applied is economic, which is to say that they represent two mechanisms to disperse funds, or if one were to be precise, subsidies. Simply think of how much money, so in my view it's more like a Lata-Asha distinction. So simply think of how much money it takes to train the average doctoral graduate student in the humanities in institutions such as ours. I think at latest count, $500,000 per capita. We don't think of theory as a kind of subsidy program to keep an ideological chain in balance, just as cows in Europe earn on average $800 per year, an income that rates higher than 1.2 billion of the world's poor. When we think theorists, we don't think paid-up cows. This is a chart by one of the best writers on the economics of knowledge production in the American Academy since the war, Philip Murawski. And it sort of, this chart sort of does, you know, what I tried to also do in Second Modernism. I found this book actually after we did that book. But it really lays out the kind of, this kind of ideological chain between the different components of what it, you know, under which a certain production of knowledge can be effected. So I think if you take the bottom two periods and if you were to sort of characterize where exactly we stand in that chain, this is the shift from ideological shift from, let's say, producing democratic citizens. I mean, we have had freedom talked about in that sense, to the business of teaching creativity as a sort of entrepreneurial field. So the difference between basic and applied draws, as we know from Kant's upside-down pyramid of epistemic validity as laid out in his conflict of the faculties. In Mark Wigley's dissertation book and articles published in the 1990s, he had brilliantly argued that this architectonic of the disinterested, the supposedly disinterested foundations of theory had in fact amounted in fact to something like a material or mnemotechnical supplement in the form of the architecture of the library, tethering the vocation of the previously itinerant university to a supposed architectural core, a centering action by architecture, even as architecture itself became a sort of invisible field or pushed to the margins. Should we reconsider that supplement of humanism now that all the vital development of universities today happen at their peripheries? And instead of knowledge production, universities are now declaring design, quote unquote, as their core mission. At MIT and Columbia alike, the buildings at the core are allowed to deteriorate. The elevator in my building at MIT hasn't been changed for 50 years, and I can think of Avery as a similar example, buildings in ruin. The periphery of the university, on the other hand, is full of shiny new speculation, branded buildings, new Ordos 100s that promise new and imminent revolutions every day. Everybody aspires to a lab of one's own. It's like Virginia Woolf in the era of venture capital, seeking not the subsidized freedom the aunt's bequest to write as one ought, but rather a launch pad to pitch for funds that will tide you over till you pitch for the next tranche of funds. Each pitch claims to redesign a world. So this may be a question for today. How will architects cope with this new profusion of design, which is to say the many kinds of activities that also lay claim today to the title of design? It is now quite conventional to state that architects' claims to validity in practice do not rely on truth criterion. But this kind of self-regard, I would submit, itself risks being outdated if one considers that the truth criterion was in fact, in the first place, the outcome of a subsidy pattern, as I've suggested, which is to say a way of apportioning committees and disciplinary boundaries. We could say that the pivotal science of the 20th century and the prime promulgator of the truth criterion was the field of physics, whose aura was further bolstered by the sense that its representational models presented a phenomenology of nature as such. In the older idea of funding, the era of big science, physics was logos, and logos was, in a matter of speaking, physics. Today's pivotal disciplinary science, by contrast, biotech, claims no such impetus towards methodological reduction or methodological reconciliation. Biotech is, strictly speaking, not so much even a discipline as an ongoing and ever-changing, if not transparent, composition of interests. I will not go into the tremendous organizational striations that go into the discovery, development, and final delivery of a drug to market, which includes a combination of big government and small government subs, big pharma, intellectual property regimes, venture capital, large financial organizations, windfall-seeking hedge funds, the parcelization and outsourcing of research activities across transnational territories, mergers and acquisitions, the construction and reconstruction of legal subjects and biological definitions of the body, newly thickened strata of university administrators and deans, the cultivation of so-called quote-unquote star professors, not to rule out the active production across these multiple terrains of what we could call aniogenesis, the production of ignorance by dint of defending proprietorial knowledge, selective reporting of data, bogus claims, you name it. In the venture capital model, a product does not need to make it to market in order to be bought or sold or to make money off it. The mere rejection of truth criteria is therefore hardly adequate to understand this composition of the commodity of design. Capital is at every stage capital, ever and only incomplete, an endless valorization of its parts without a teleology of the whole. What Marx called the MCM cycle can be realized in every unit of a presumed production function. A critical question in that respect would be to ask, given this tremendous organizational and geographical striation of what is today called knowledge-driven capitalism, what is the status of this new architectural evanescence at the periphery of the university? Another way of asking the question would be, what is the place of the university as a node of knowledge production in these circuits of data-driven capital? From what I can discern, I would argue that never has this connection between knowledge and the knowledge economy been quite so tenuous. All the university perhaps offers today is perhaps something like a locale, a kind of prestigious address so that capital that is in fact located elsewhere can claim to have a home. And for those of us who went to Princeton, and since the Princetonians have already been insulted, I think it's perfectly fine to insult it some more. I think of this as the sort of Witherspoon Street problem. As graduate student, living off $400 of stipend, it's like, why could we never afford the food in the restaurants on Witherspoon Street? And it was basically the real estate value was way higher in order to, there's a whole other clientele that actually made use of the street. And Princeton, the very presence of the university is what drove the values up, right? So the university is now, only and ever, a piece of attractive real estate, which is to say real estate through and through. Humanities is like an inconvenient piece of old rent-controlled housing that is to be seen more and more in need of either demolition or alternatively gentrification, which is to say its conversion into promotional copywriting for the new state of affairs. What will our traditional conceptions of theory make of any of this? Very little, I suspect, other than lament the loss of former subsidies by invoking a truth criterion which it was itself theoretically devoted to demolishing. Lyotard had, in the 1970s, had signaled that the rise of the utility principle in apportioning research funds was already sounding the death knell of the age of professors. I mean, in a sense, the secularism of the various cadres of ancient professions that were secularized in the world, I think the professoriate within universities was perhaps the last to be secularized. I mean, we were the last to sort of get the story, to be defrocked, in other words. But in my view, Lyotard was also wrong in the sense that the end of the era of professors did not lead to, per se, a kind of heightening of the utility paradigm, because in the end one doesn't know what utility is. So in the context of the university, I think what we did end up after the era of the professors was the era of the dean. So Mark invited us to come talk about theory, but I think it would be also perversely boring and yet boringly perverse, but also perverse, I mean, importantly perverse, to sort of have maybe a conference on deans, where rather than professors sort of talking about what they value or not value and what they're for and what they're against, we'd really try to think about what the dean does, which is to say, I mean this in much more sort of serious tone than I'm sort of letting on, which is to say that the dean's office in some ways is precisely the place where interests get played out, where epistemology at some level reaches its limit in terms of counting as value. So if I were ever to organize such a conference, Mark, I think, would be my first invitee. But in any case, let me welcome back Mark to the professoriate. Thank you.
From New Haven, Keller, Easterling.
Thank you. Is there a slide before that? Okay, that's good. Yeah. So I wanted to offer something very simple about the dispositions we impose on theory. Beyond its content, what are we making? Beyond what we're making theory say, what are we making theory do? We shove it into segregating and quarantining dispositions. We force it into litigating binaries. We seal it into isomorphic arrangements. The disposition of theory, its temperaments, propensities, can even permit or deny information. Disposition can shape theory into provisional temporal assumption on the way to an altered habit of mind, or alternatively as an ossifying bully of thought. Dispositions not only permit or deny information, they color it, pinch it, deform it, parboil it. And what do we miss when, what information do we delete with a segregating, a binary, or an isomorphic disposition? Consider this the segregating or quarantining disposition, like the old laughable segregation of theory and practice that used to dominate discussions and generate tireless circular conversations, or the reactionary post-critical that would have the thought police lock away theory so that it would no longer muddle with its dangerous woolliness the purity of making, or the countering quarantining of the high-minded and the rhetorical to protect against the practical or the real, the segregation of thought by generations, the segregation of thought by formalized discourses, the quarantining of subspecialties in the discipline, theory, practice, research, history, even when we know that theory loves evidence, both historical and contemporary, and evidence loves theory, even though we know they just want to be together. Consider the isomorphic disposition. Here, theory is shaped into religion. No longer the supposition that opens onto more information, it becomes a technique for excluding information and arranging what's left in a self-referential array. Or theory becomes an elaborate locution to be chanted long enough for others to chant it and give themselves the authority to exclude those who can't. In discussing the sciences, Latour has likened this isomorphic disposition of theory to that of a plant, which, having so much success with photosynthesis, concludes that the entire world is run from chlorophyll. Scientific theory can be used to continually confirm assumptions rather than test and expand assumptions, to ingrain rather than change habits of mind. The isomorphic disposition is the control error that eliminates information, overlooks contradiction to maintain a solid state. It's the disposition of Jesus when he says, "You are with me or against me," making a childish category mistake that mistakes part for whole. The disposition also shares habits with the avant-garde, dramatically, nonsensically insisting that information must kill information, knowledge must be successive rather than coexistent. In the isomorphic disposition, stray from the family of disciples or stray from the central doctrine of, for instance, capital, and you are either a dangerous enemy or a weak, vacillating, equivocal, interdisciplinary indeterminate, and you must be tolerated or eliminated. Ooh, I'm scared. Still, we cling to isomorphic dispositions even when the cast iron theories of, for instance, capital, prevent us from seeing the parallel markets that trade with other social logics, irrational desires, and dangerous masks, even when, in other words, to be so determinate is not to be vigilant enough. And telescoping down into any discipline, we can hear the faint cries of even tinier isomorphic tempests, since it's well known that the smaller the point, the more insufferable the unbeliever comes to the believer. Consider the binary disposition. With this disposition, there can be no progress of thought without debate. It's a strange assumption on its own, like the assumption that we can only care about a story if there's a murder or a conflict. Ideas can only emerge from dialect. There's no other form of questioning or puzzling. Theory is litigation. Theory is scrimmage. And returning to the disposition of the quarantine or segregation or segregating, there's great sport in agitating for these segregated groups, theory, practice, history, to fight each other and to challenge each other to duels. How else can thought advance? Debate is surely one source of the contradiction, the error, the extrinsic information that jolts theory forward, nourishes theory. But when is our debate only the staged wrestling between known players that preserves a set of comfortable discourses intact? When debate becomes the object, we can get together regularly and throw ourselves against an open door, a satisfying exertion to stand in for the work performed on the world's wicked problems. Or do binary dispositions make us continually see enemies and innocents in our activism? Do they continue to encourage histories organized around dramatic conflicts like wars? War, the favorite staple of history, creates epic tableaux that often upstage the nerdier, less dramatic, but potentially more consequential evidence. So, these segregating, isomorphic, binary dispositions and other default dispositions that may be diagnostics for assessing the propensities or the restrictions of our theory that may delete the very information that we need. They can be worn on a string like a necklace and kept handy. And maybe that would be something simple enough to say, and I could sit down. But beyond the meta-theoretical critique, and presumably we want a diagnostic for a political theater more consequential than that of architecture culture. If theory is about thinking hard and thinking differently, what extra evidence and information might a dispositional register help to theorize space? What additional ways of knowing or speculating or theorizing? And there's nothing to succeed or correct or supplant or oppose, just more expansive pastures beyond the one into which we overly adaptive architects have crowded. You all know, I've been wondering about what this dispositional register reveals, what larger pastures it might open onto with regard to form making and activism, wondering how spatial variables might play a larger role as points of leverage in the extra-state craft of global governance. And you all know, I mean, I've been looking at these kinds of spaces. The matrix, matrix space, the repeatable formulas and spatial products that make most of the space in the world. There's actually orders. The Shenzhens and Dubais of the world. It's like an operating system that makes certain things possible and certain things impossible. An operating system for shaping de facto forms of polities, the protocols, sequences, routines, schedules, all the activities or rules of game in the urban milieu. And like our theory, in addition to all the things it's saying, sometimes its real currency is in what it's doing. So forgive me if this sounds a bit like hokum, but when Mark Twain was a riverboat captain, he always said that he thought his passengers were reading sort of framed landscape views that passed by as if reading a pleasant sort of graphic novel, while he was reading a much more grave and dangerous novel, reflected in the face of the water, all the dimples and ripples that indicated all the shifting shoals of the Mississippi. So what he was reading can only be called the disposition of the water, like we are trying to read the disposition of theory. And it required almost instantaneous oscillations between evidence and theory. To borrow from Gilbert Ryle's formulation, it was a situation where you could not know that, you could only know how. How was dispositional, unfolding, latent. Knowing how was, ironically or not ironically, indeterminate to be practical, or theoretical to be practical, indeterminate to be vigilant. This space is the secret weapon of some of the most powerful people on earth because it's doing sneaky things that are different from what it's saying. So to deal with it, one needs object forms like those that we're usually trained to make, but one also needs to theorize active forms that are dispositional, time-released, like bits of code to hack the operating system, form in another gear or register that's shaping things as well as an interplay of things. And if we recognize only one way of making or knowing, like the pleasant landscape novel, think what we miss. We can only then handle objects or objects rhetorically while the world's most powerful players run circles around us. They would never want to know that. It's too weak. They know how to handle and deploy the world's dangers and uncertainties and irrationalities and duplicities. At the moment, even though space is the durable outcome, this operating system is scripted by financial quants and McKinsey consultants and World Bank yes men, and it's scripted in the language of econometrics and informatics and management ease. Still, some of the most interesting thinkers in the social, political, and economic sciences are questioning the presumptions of their discipline or the supposed authority of their science. They want to know how. Because they're searching for more complex context. And because space is clearly a useful testbed, the possibility of leading with spatial variables is what, for me, lends a bit of urgency to theory. And here, one doesn't want to mistake the sort of dilute its interdisciplinarity for its opposite being, the chance to place spatial practices undiluted at a consequential crossroads between the disciplines. It's a chance to work artfully on the irrationality that rules the world in ways that go beyond the rhetorical and foreground what we as architects know how to do. Might we know how to ride in reverse over the space made by economic variables and power plays, substituting spatial variables with different points of leverage. Not only things, but interplays, interdependencies, little engines of space. There may be dispositions of space as well as dispositions or temperaments of theory that allow us to ally ourselves in this way. Honestly, I don't know. that I am doing it. I'm trying to know how to do it. I'm trying studios like improvisational classes, books like rehearsals. If theory is something you use while you're working on something you can't figure out, something that doesn't look like what you know, maybe with knowing how, one finds oneself unannounced doing what one set out to do. But doesn't it mostly cause us to say, I don't know, 1,000,000 times a minute? Doing so while rapidly oscillating between thinking and failing and making and failing. The opposite of rhetorical paralysis. Something impractical on its way to being a new practical, something illogical, risky, harebrained, hard. Even though we sometimes segregate it, knowing how is theoretical. Theoretical to be practical, theoretical to be vigilant, theoretical to be rigorous. So maybe all I want to say, expressing some impatience with myself, is that I want to know how. But Mark asked me, oh, I have some more of these, sorry. But Mark asked me to make a little announcement. So that was for the end of my remarks. But Mark asked me to make a little announcement as an addendum to my contribution today. And in some ways, it returns to the question he asked about the history of theory that he posed to all of us, theory, maybe also theory from 2000, 2014. For the kind of theory we are discussing today, the historical project is vigorous and demanding. It's not the place for the usual clanking apparatus of primordial moments and kings and dauphins and bracketing movements marked by an inventory of manifestos and successions of thought. The historian sometimes has to report about events and careers that construct themselves to slot directly into the boilerplate of histories, but otherwise this historian is moving through a much more complex and confounding matrix of both evidence and intellectual temperaments. Not just because he has many friends in the room, but maybe Detlef Mertens joins this conversation at this juncture. And in his essay, Modernity Unbound, Detlef contemplates the histories of modernity. He looks at those moments when modernism, framed as a, quote, new norm and presented with a unified voice, became as codified as the codes it intended to question, like the isomorphic disposition. He suggests that modernism was never, quote, a thing, but a relationship, end quote. A relationship changing from moment to moment within the context and within the ever-shifting context of modernity. As if responding to Mark's question, Detlef argues that seen in this light, histories of modernity, quote, assume a new urgency, end quote, as they select from and frame that unfolding context. Like the indeterminate to be practical or vigilant, here's again the indeterminate to be rigorous. Of his own historical project, Detlef wrote, I think there was another slide there. Anyway, Detlef wrote, I came to focus on things that had been misunderstood or overlooked in the historical record and could therefore serve as new mediators, as mediators for thought and design. The writing of architectural history can close down the past or open it up anew. It can bind historical experience into yet another ism, or can unlock the life and modernité that resides in the modernisms we already have. Before Detlef died, he asked Felicity Scott, who's here, and Ed Dimmenberg and Barry Bergdahl, and me to shepherd to press his book on Mies. I was going to show you a picture of it. If you find that slide, you can put it up. And we thought, here I'll see. We thought that the publication of the book this spring seemed the right occasion to announce the Detlef Mertens Lecture on the Histories of Modernity, which is an annual lecture beginning in the spring of 2015 here at Columbia. There it is. The lecture hopes to provide a platform for young scholars and innovative, rigorous scholarship that inflects contemporary discourse. It's an opportunity to return to the questions and experiments that Detlef and other historians here have raised, looking for critical approaches that enliven and unsettle the project of writing history. Columbia is clearly the best home for this lecture. There's arguably been some subsiding of the default or restrictive dispositions of theory here at Columbia in the last 15 years. A place where there's been a lot of taking risks and asking questions and wandering away from the duals and isomorphisms, leaving the gates of the pasture open and placing resources further afield to draw us out. Mark Wigley's done so much to artfully shape this productive disposition, so the announcement of the annual lecture is coupled with enormous thanks to him. Thanks.
So I suppose to be fond of someone is to actually just like to listen to them, as listening to you. And of course we suffer from not being able to listen to Detlef. So this annual lecture is an attempt to sort of listen to what shouldn't be a prize like in the Indian movie business, but a voice that's emerging, that is to say, you're starting to hear it. And maybe the next speaker would have been invited to give such a lecture as such an emerging voice, but in a certain sense already emerged. So from Oberlin, John. But imagine that this is the beginning of that listening. And it's so beautiful that this book is coming out and that literally we continue to listen to Detlef. And each speaker from now on becomes a kind of ventriloquist, not in the name of memory, actually, and certainly not in the name of nostalgia, but of the work. I mean, really of the work. So he's another worker. I told you at the beginning that all the speakers today are unwell. This is no exception.
Oh boy, that was a lot to follow. But congratulations, Keller, on the appearance of the book. I have it sitting on the dining room table, and its imposing presence is something that I'm certainly going to commit myself to delving into. So in response to Mark's, I think, rather generously broad prompt here to consider an urgency of architectural theory, and moreover an urgency that is somehow recent or current or present, I can't, of course, resist the historian's vice of turning to a past urgency, and one that's been repeatedly and even willfully forgotten, the demand for a response on the part of architects and engineers to the demands of a newly wired world, whose technical basis no longer quite seemed to fit the conventions of architectural production in that present. And I think we remain in an uncomfortable situation vis-a-vis the loops of wires that are threaded through our only apparently wireless world. So as a way into the problem, I brought along two pieces of evidence, a poem and an anecdote, each delivered on the occasion of Cass Gilbert's death in 1934. And it was amazing to see in Lucia's presentation earlier already Finley and Gilbert in their institutional relationship reach the screen already today. So a happy echo, hopefully, for a sad event, the passing of Gilbert. So the poem is by Gilbert's intimate friend, John Finley. And then the anecdote is from his wife, Julia. In the first, the wireless, i.e. radio, is both a technical means to defy or defer the passing of the architect from the stage of a world history, to reach him on his ship, floating on the vast briny inn, and also to recall him to his duty of making a spatial order on behalf of something called the human race. In the second, and so here I'll just give you, I'm used to using one computer at a time. There's the arch-bloviator Cass Gilbert, and I always like thinking of him in that portrait in relationship to a logistical enterprise like this building. But the second document is this anecdote from Julia Gilbert. Let's see, somehow I've managed to lose my place. Sorry about that. What you see in this story, which I won't read to you, I detest being read to when I can see the story, is Gilbert actually experiencing the terror that many members of the uninitiated public experienced when first asked to be on the radio, the terror of mic fright. And I think there's an obvious reading here, which is that Gilbert was unwilling to learn the rigorous discipline of transposing one medium, public speech, which he was quite good at, to radio broadcast. But I think it worth noting that Julia Gilbert did not only note her husband's embarrassment, but also that embarrassment of the announcer, who in the face of the architect's failure to speak, and to speak about architecture, that was his subject on this occasion, is at a loss to fill in the dead air that follows. We architectural historians and theorists are, in the face of the inadequacy of our historiography to fundamental questions regarding techniques, rather like that poor announcer from time to time, looking around the studio desperate for a crooner or an orchestra to fill in for us. So, how do we get here, and how did Cass get here? So a book project that I'm pursuing currently, and it's in its very early stages, is an attempt to answer that question through an investigation of mass media architectures, architectures built for telephony, radio, and television. And I'm going to talk a little bit about radio briefly today. This history is not one of an architecture on the radio, i.e. of architecture as some putative content of another medium. There we go. Like we might imagine in an instance like Sir Nicholas Pesner parroting somebody else's nationalism in the form of a kind of neo-Kunstgeography. I don't want to write that history at all. Rather, I would like to, and I also would like to avoid thinking of this as a mediatic story of supersession of media, where architecture is replaced by immaterial, miniaturized, and invisible technologies. Rather, this history will look to that architecture which was a necessary component of a larger mass media apparatus. So what follows today is just a few notes from that history by way of attempting to speak to our current perplexity in the face of an ever more dense wiring of the world that seems to silence us, even when the noise of chattering and twittering and texting and so on is quite deafening. So, telecommunications was, in the first instance, wireless, but it always had walls. As the first short history of telephony, written after the invention of the bell system, relates, the ear trumpet and the speaking trumpet were early instances of communicating sound at great distance, allowing sound waves to travel further through the medium of air because, quote, the walls, I keep doing that because I'm using two computers at once. Sorry about that. There we go. Using, quote, the walls of the tube, which reduced the loss of energy from spherical action, end quote. Whether it was the human voice projected through one of Athanasius Kircher's architectonic tubes meant to project the sound of an opera performance outside of a building, or one of Wolfgang von Kempelen's speaking machines, the increase in volume, prevention of decay, and so on of a given sound was accomplished through tectonic means. Even though many inventors can lay claim to the discovery of a means of telecommunications through a solid as opposed to a gaseous medium well beforehand, the scientist, inventor, and entrepreneur, Sir Charles Wheatstone, deserves credit for picking up an often ignored observation, almost a throwaway really, from the preface to Robert Hooke's 1667 Micrographia. As Hooke boasted there, quote, I can assure the reader that I have, by the help of a distended wire, propagated the sound to a very considerable distance in an instant, or with as seemingly quick a motion as that of light, at least comparably swifter than that which at the same time was propagated through the air, and this not only in a straight line, or direct, but in one bended in many angles, end quote. Wheatstone resuscitated these experiments in a sequence that would lead him to share in developing the first commercial electric telegraph, in parallel with his ongoing research into the nature of sound as propagated by vibrations in the air. After reproducing Hooke's experiments and devising his own, Wheatstone demonstrated that a, quote, conducting wire for transmission of sounds, end quote, could be attached to the sounding board of a musical instrument, such as a pianoforte or a harp, at a perpendicular angle, which would then transmit the sounds to a similar instrument via its sounding board at the other end. Moreover, he writes in one of his scientific papers on the topic, quote, "The sound of an instrument may be at the same time transmitted to more than one place. For instance, communications may be made from a square pianoforte to a resounding instrument above and to another below. And the communication may even be continued through a series of reciprocating instruments. If the instruments be not in adjacent rooms, but be further removed from each other, a person, a person in the intermediate room through which the conductor passes will hear no sound but what is communicated by the ordinary means. Hence, it would be possible to extend a horizontal conductor through a series of rooms belonging to different houses, and, provided the instrument connected with one of its extremities be constantly played upon, to hear at pleasure the performance in any of these rooms, merely by attaching a reciprocating instrument to the conductor. On removing this instrument, the sonorous undulations would pass inaudibly to the next apartment." End quote. Similarly, Wheatstone observed, one could produce a generic sounding board to resound all of the instruments in an entire orchestra in order to transmit them via the conducting wire to another place. Wheatstone noted that the sounding board could only register, of course, a faint signal. Optimistically, though, he reported that, quote, "On placing the ear close to the reciprocating instrument at the other end, a diminutive band is heard, in which all the instruments preserve their distinctive qualities. The effect is as a landscape seen in miniature beauty through a concave lens." With this set of observations, I could argue, I won't push the point too hard, a wired world is emerging, maybe even born, a mass media challenge to the primacies of other media such as print, and Wheatstone was one of its most aggressive theorists. He noted that because sound travels roughly 17 times faster through iron wire, glass, cane, or dealwood rods than it does through the air, or as many had it well into the 20th century and beyond, the ether, it would be, quote, "as easy to transmit sounds through such conductors from Aberdeen to London as it is now to establish a connection from one chamber to another," end quote. All that was needed was a means of communicating sounds produced in the air with sufficient intensity to solid bodies. Microphones and amplifiers and the like were some ways off yet, even if Wheatstone had developed the former device in a very rudimentary way. But the conceptual organization of Wheatstone's experiments allowed for a full vision of communication from machine to machine over vast distances at high speeds. It's perhaps natural, but I don't necessarily believe it's reasonable or even sanely irrational, to focus on the medium of the wire as the primary protagonist of media histories after this point. But I'm going to stick with it for a little bit. This is precisely because the wire begets, in its various heydays, a complex of techno-ethical crises, appearing and disappearing seemingly at will. The wired world, even as Wheatstone's interconnected musical instruments made clear, was one in which the relationship of architecture to telephony, or if you like, from walls to wires, was inverted. Instead of serving as a direct means of bounding, reflecting, and projecting sound, or language, and any other metaphor that you'd like to use for that act of communication, architecture had to be interconnected and penetrated by solid media of a different technical character. A glance at the multiple switchboard that you see here from the 1880s is, I hope, temporarily enough to carry the point. And I'm obviously no architect, but I scribbled that down to try to explain the point. The intricate web of wires penetrates the architecture of the telephone exchange building according to its own logic and requires the design of an interface at the scale of furniture, in the case of the switching station, in order to make the business of switching manageable for its female operators. So by the time Marconi and an international coterie of inventors, engineers, amateur enthusiasts, and so on had developed so-called wireless telegraphy near the turn of the 20th century, these networks of wires had been threaded through buildings on urban, regional, and national scales by increasingly massive corporate concerns, including the largest corporation ever to exist on Earth, the American Telephone and Telegraph. And a wired infrastructure had even bridged oceans. But the magic, and that's a word that is endemic to the literature of radio, of transmitting electromagnetic radiation through the air as opposed to along wires, led to a temporary belief that these wires and the walls that served as their inconvenient adjuncts would no longer be necessary. Radio is only ever, apparently, wireless. In fact, the complexity of the machinery needed for even an artificially simple live broadcast, i.e. leaving out essential recording and playback loops, demanded an amount of wiring an order of magnitude greater than even the largest of telephone switching installations. As a cantankerous, but as the great historian of the BBC, Asa Briggs writes, but on the whole, reasonably friendly critic of broadcasting in the earliest days of the BBC put it, I do not like the description wireless. Why describe the thing as a negation? And so we have to think about this inversion, I think, quite carefully, and then to think about the way in which architecture is actually called into service in order to accommodate this vast mess of wires. And the distinction between the radio apparatus and architecture in its early stages is the problem that's trying to be solved here. How do you actually bring the 168-foot mast and the sort of posh vacation hotel into some sort of happy synthesis? So I'm going to skip over some historical work, but the unhappiness of their juxtaposition and its dangers are stood in for by these images. The first comprehensive published statement on the theory of radio station design appeared rather late, in the form of an article by the architect Dexter Purinton in the pages of American Architect in 1935. Purinton began his article, Radio, a New Architectural Problem, by noting that precisely because the physics of radio broadcasting was but poorly understood, even by the experts themselves, the architect faces not so much the problem of housing complicated machinery as that of providing a kind of insulated shelter in which a dangerously powerful force can be safely bent to the service of an engineering technique expanding with rapidity. That's Purinton speaking. Purinton's prod at the engineers, physicists, and inventors of radio puts one in mind of the criticism that is so often made of Marconi himself by his many biographers, that he did not understand radio broadcasting technology at all. He just made it, mostly cobbling together other inventors' discoveries. Purinton was clearly at pains to stake out a role for architects in the exciting young field of radio architectural design through an appeal to a perceived risk that only architects could ameliorate. So, in other words, he elevates the stakes. The source and character of this danger were multiple. In strictly physical terms, because radio frequency current passes through air and matter alike, quote, this is Purinton, it is most easily conducted, not in the body of a material, but along its surface, and if not properly grounded, will collect upon a surface until it jumps viciously across space to the nearest point of contact. Electrical current shocks, but radio frequency burns, often so deeply that death results, even though only a slight shock is present, end quote. Thus, the architect needed to provide a redundant system of grounding throughout radio station buildings. The slightest spark could destroy not only equipment, but kill its human operators as well. Every piece of metal in the building, no matter how small, had to be connected with a secure bond to other metal pieces and a continuous connection to the ground. The interior of a transmitting station must be completely enclosed with some sort of metallic shield, Purinton wrote. And since radio frequency ionizes dust and causes sparks, the same noted by observers of Marconi's earliest station on the Isle of Wight, the control room of the station needed to be kept in a state of absolute cleanliness. Purinton recommended a forced air cooling system. The interiors of these metal buildings with generators and resistors humming would of course be quite hot, with paper filtration and all plumbing pipes kept at the exterior of the building as much as possible to isolate them from dangerous potentials. They use also rubber pipes and all sorts of interesting invented jury-rigged pieces of architectural and infrastructural apparatus. But the most important constraint on the architect's design is the one about the way that the building itself was laid out, which is why I'm trying to illustrate that with these two very diagrammatic plans that Purinton presents of his own design. He was a project architect for Voorhees, Cavell, and Walker. He says that you have to understand the architecture of radio is governed by a different geometry. Rather than thinking of the building in terms of square foot areas, units for radio transmission are best arranged to minimize lengths of all bus and cable connections. So the inhabitable areas of the building would thus be organized so as to facilitate shortening the length of the wiring. By thinking of the building first as a long service chase, folded back on itself, housing a dense web of wires. This meant that even when as efficiently organized as was then possible, a medium-sized 50-kilowatt radio station would require an absolute minimum of 60,000 cubic feet of space. This is just for the wires, not for the people. The already minimal habitable interior of the building would also be as open as possible, since interior obstructions would produce dangerous electrical potentials, which I already mentioned. So the radio station as an architectural artifact became an intricately layered series of shells. So here's the relatively tame-looking exterior, and then this slightly creepier interior. The outer structure of the building corresponded roughly to conventional tectonic arrangements, but this surrounded a layer of chases, which then surrounded a layer of insulation, which then surrounded two inhabitable interiors, one for the wires and one for the engineers. All of this complex structure and the sophisticated geometries of the wiring systems themselves, threaded out on and through various boards and boxes, was necessary to realize a relatively simple geometry of an undulating wave rippling outwards in every direction from the top of a broadcasting tower. Purinton offered up his own design for WOR's station, but it's a relatively small-scale station. It illustrates some of the principles of radio architecture, but I would be remiss if I didn't introduce just a few more of the problems that this future history I intend to write needs to solve. The first thing to note is that there's much more than transmission to consider. Given that radio was produced through a massive complex of storage and playback media, running from print to phonography to film to architecture to transmission towers and beyond, it is easy to forget the invisible origins of the radio signal, the administrative offices necessary to governing radio production, and the performance and recording studios in which the supposed content of the new medium was played, captured, synchronized, and transmitted. And perhaps the most significant building from the early period of radio to accommodate both of these essential aspects of the radio apparatus in a single building was this, the headquarters of the BBC in Broadcasting House on Portland Place in London. Designed in 1928 by George Valmeyer and the wonderfully named Marmaduke T. Tudsbury, along with Raymond McGrath, Serge Chermayeff, Edward Maffei, Wells Coates, and many, many others, and completed in 1932 in its first iteration. This Art Deco rabbit warren of offices, I always see the Tower of Babel whenever I look at these photographs. Offices and studios in Portland Place is far too complex to really address, but I can't just leave it there and tantalize you like that, so I just brought along a few images that will serve as riddles that I'm trying to incorporate into a more systematic discussion of the reorganization of architectural space that's demanded by radio. So whether it's the very strange interfaces of the control room at the very top of the building, approximate to the transmission towers, or it is this very complex section which coordinates office space, library space, concert hall, and so on. Here a section gives you a little bit more insight into its complexity. Or it is the way in which the interior of the building is actually designed in order to provide the employees with a representation of what it is that they are accomplishing by producing radio as a technology at all. And that's most thoroughly explored in this curious film, one of the first films to ever be shown on television in the UK, Death at Broadcasting House, in which the employees actually star in the film. And they build sets in order to make this film of their own thing, of their own building inside of Broadcasting House. So it's this sort of weird simulation inside of simulation inside of simulation that's necessary for imagining radio as an architectural artifact in these years. And then at a very serious technical level on the exploration of things like HVAC and so on as insulation as well as cooling, a way of making hermetically sealed spaces inhabitable for human beings is also of interest. But to conclude and return to the core question, if it can be said that media determine our situation, then we also have to ask what situates those media. There can be little question that in architecture, one produced, as it were, by a lost theory here, plays its role. So one urgency, I'm just guessing, might be to recover that theory as best we can in service of a description of a wired architecture that so sensationally deprives us today of the wires that actually bind us. So I'll leave you with the 38-mile loop. Thanks.
This is the modest role of the moderator is to see if there are any questions from the audience. I have some backup questions, naturally. Since I'm usually asking questions from the audience. I'll first ask if there are questions from the audience.
Actually, it was nice to have all the lights on.
Yeah, turn up the lights, please. Well, maybe I'll ask my question. Might as well get them out of the way. In Keller, and they're for Keller and Arindam initially because, and I mean, all three, for me anyway, all three presentations did define urgencies of, I think, in really very different but associated ways. And I guess I wanted to kind of ask just a point of clarification from maybe Keller and Arindam's treatment of the problem, which was to some degree to refer agency to some other domain, maybe to and these it takes different forms. This referral of agency to funds or deans or administrators or bureaucracies or offstage influences of which the professor and the sort of myopic operation of architecture or the what I thought was really Keller's brilliant responsiveness to clearly theoretical possibilities that are both malevolent and bullying and solidifying and ossifying, and at the same time, you know, can be creative and eye-opening and other things and instrumental. So in some way we keep, it seems odd that we keep reestablishing a sort of place or a kind of place for the action to be happening to us or to, you know, to the university or to the professor or to the theorist or whatever, and that it's important to keep calling in our awareness. Maybe this relates to the wireless project as well, refocusing our awareness out of this sort of, you know, myopicness of discourse or of disciplinary work or the kind of false you know, false idea that you're pursuing education in a sort of old sense or what. So I'm wondering if that's true. Is it a displacement or is it just everything kind of disperses at the boundaries into, you know, into an impossible, you know, there's no cohesion or there's no cohered place to which you can actually look to, you know, sort of engage with that problem.
I'll just premise my response by giving sort of a two-sentence definition of agency, as I see it. When we talk about an agent of the East India Company or an insurance agent, we never presume that they're acting in their own interests. So agency is all, you know, if we think of ourselves as free, there's a constitution that mandates that we are free. In other words, agency is always a carriage of some other agency that places us in its place, right? So for me, that this is not necessarily to understand that one is agent only in the sense that one is carrying a certain institutional impetus is for me neither controversial nor problematic. I mean, as teachers, we teach curricula which are meant to, you know, carry some broader discourse in the name. So the professor is through and through in that sense an agent. The real problem, if I were to state it as such, is to understand then that agency is therefore through and through historically bound, and not to eternalize a particular consensus that we may have been used to, thinking that this is sort of the normative. And so if I were to cite a certain Derrida or a certain Derrida reading a certain Heidegger. There's this clearing of the ground to understand that there is no ground on which one stands, right? And from there to talk about ground. So that is the enterprise here, more so than guilting or accusing or whether deans or architects or professors or shaming, etc. Just to understand that we are in this play. And everything that we do is in this play, and in that sense, everything that we do is strategic and tactical, at the very least. But there is, in that sense, a broader shift in the status of the university, which is pretty definitive. And so, in that sense, if you consider that theory is grounded in the vocation of the humanities, broadly speaking, we have to remember that prior to the Second World War, the humanities were more or less ensconced within the salons of the liberal elite. Pretty much, I mean, who could afford to do humanities but the rich? I mean, Walter Benjamin was rich. So what we see in the aftermath of the Second World War is an institutional impetus towards the democratization of the humanities, premised precisely on certain ideological value chains that I talked about. And all I'm saying today is that that value chain probably no longer holds, and therefore the humanities or creativity is being pushed into a certain kind of para-economic activity, which is evident in every day. I mean, it's in its everydayness that it makes itself apparent. That, for me, that is where theory must begin, at that sort of ground where there is no ground.
I was just trying to point out a split between what theory is saying and what it's doing, which is always the way I have been looking at it. What theory is doing, the dispositions that we impose on it, when the ways in which they can permit or deny information, the ways in which they can erase the very thing that you're trying to build up, the ways in which just the disposition itself can delete the information that we need. Now obviously, to model something like that in our architecture culture or in academia is potentially useful, but it's only useful if it's somehow just a model for what one, for a larger kind of political theater. But for me, without being able to see that dispositional register, I had the sense of being completely unarmed to deal with evidence in the world. Can't look at the political theater of Putin or Putin and Snowden and just have the knowledge, just know that's not going to help you to sort of sort through the shifts and turns of what they're doing. What they're doing is so different from what they're saying. So that seems like some fun.
Well, that's one of the things that really attracts me to this radio thing as a project, because there's a ton of history of radio stuff, and it's all about what people were doing on the radio, basically. So who was singing what, and who was giving what speech. And it's not about, except in a very small number of instances, about the institutions that produce it. And so if there's this divide, right, between different dispositions of theory which actually produce artifacts, then we're, in this instance, contenting ourselves to this point with simply historicizing what a certain theoretical and political project would like us to worry about, which is Pevsner on the radio. Benjamin's musings on the metropolis and enlightenment for children, and not, in fact, the artifice that is intensely complex that produces those effects.
I think that. That makes it's terrifically important. I think what's being said, and part of what I'm thinking is that there is a certain kind of perpetual and necessary re-dialectization all the time of the party, or the parties or entities, or somehow those postures or dispositions involved, and it doesn't matter. It's a kind of, but it's a sort of abiding structure, so that even though we want to say yes, theory is a kind of model for. And it loves evidence, as you say, and that it makes use of evidence nonstop, and it also evidence makes use of theory, and it's kind of a happy bedfellows. And then at the same time, each has its own domain, and there's a sort of will to power on both sides. Architecture continues to talk about spatiality, which, if anything, is implicated by if anything is implicated by, let's say, the ability to see behind the political event or something else, it's the possibility of anything like what we mean when we say space, in a certain sense, right?
We've been sort of discussing this at MIT a little bit, is that are architects really invested in space? I posed this to my design colleagues, is that whatever happened to the plan? Are plans,
right,
still a viable, if that's one representation of space. Yeah. So I'm not entirely sure the architects today are interested in space, but it could be a claim.
Remarks? I know you're hungry, but overcoming. Should we?
I think we could.
A few more minutes.
That would actually constitute a kind of observable, because we could start the afternoon session when we said we were going to. But I just want to observe that A through H is unbelievably good and eloquent, and it's putting a huge pressure on
We even go through
the rest of the alphabet.
We go through I, yeah. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Well, you were playing the role of C.
That's right. I was playing the role of C, and now I'm playing the role of I. That's right. Good.
Start again at 2:15. Thank you so much for watching.
Yes, great paper.